In this episode, Joseph Lowe, co-editor of the Green Book and an economist at HM Treasury, speak to us about the success of better business cases and its use within a multitude of programs. Joseph describes how he applies the science of business analysis to a broad range of activity, including biodiversity, where it has been necessary to bring together a wide range of technical skills and opinions to generate the optimum solution for the short, medium and long term. Recognizing that things will change as time passes reinforces the value of the approach. Joseph stresses the importance of training in that people need to understand the value of each part of the process to get maximum benefit. Without using the process, if you start with a silly idea, you can still arrive at a preferred solution, albeit the least silliest. He talks about the experience of the Welsh Government in training people where it has shown a 40% reduction in the effort needed to generate compelling business cases. In his view, the Japanese idea of 2/3 planning and 1/3 application holds very true for the development of business cases. Finally, Joseph discusses optimism bias, which is a very human behavior, and he rejects the idea that AI, such as ChatGPT, could write a good business case, as it couldn't consider the politics with a small p of all the factors that need to be taken into account. Listen on and hear an interesting conversation with Joseph Lowe. Welcome to this episode of Implementing Best Practice in Business. We're here to help you and your organisation understand and implement global best practice to help you face the business challenges of today. Join me, Richard Pharro, CEO of APMG International, in talking to leaders and practitioners who have applied these frameworks and practices to boost their productivity. They're here, willing to share their knowledge and experience to help you learn from them so you can do the same to make you more competitive in today's market. My guest today is Joseph Lowe, not the 19th century economist and statistician, but one who is very much alive today. Having spent the majority of his career in several challenging private sector industries, about 17 years ago, Joseph joined the Treasury in the UK to help improve the delivery of public value. He has been largely responsible for the Treasury's Green Book and has led on each revision and the restructuring of it since 2018. He's also authored a range of supplementary Green Book guidance, and interestingly is currently working with a group of experts to produce guidance on how to value biodiversity. Together with a very close colleague, Dr. Joe Flanagan, who was the original author of the Treasury's 5-case model, they have spent the last few years promoting the importance of eliminating what Joseph calls wishful thinking and ensuring policy objectives deliver concrete results through realistic planning of strategic portfolios, programs and projects. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. Very pleased to be here.
Joseph, we launched the BBC's certification scheme 12 years ago, and over 20,000 people have now been on the training course and taken the exam. When you had the idea of producing, creating, leading on the development of a training course and a certification program, did you ever think it would be this popular?
I hoped it would be. I didn't know that it would catch on, but I felt that there was tremendous reason to believe that it might. So it was a hope and a belief in its value, and the fact that all over the public sector and even in the private sector, actually, there are people having to think about getting money to spend, capital spending, if you like, that would of itself generate the need to maintain things, so it would affect revenue spending and everything going forward. And they wanted to do it for good reasons, and they couldn't articulate themselves or find the best way of doing it. And I thought they would find it very useful. And along with Joe Flanagan, who I met in the middle of 2006, I had one half of a methodology and he had the other half, which we brought them together. We realized would answer a great majority of the problems people had. our frustration was, how could we get this information out to them in sufficient detail and keep doing it? Because people change jobs all the time for very good reasons. There's tremendous churn in the workforce, and many people perhaps only have to make the case for a big spending decision once or twice in their working life. So, that you can't expect them to retain always that level of knowledge and expertise. So how to provide it and continue to maintain it and provide a support system, and just how could we do that? And we felt there would be demand once people understood it. So it was hope, but hope was founded on belief and, in fact, our own experience, because both Joe and I had a lifetime, he in the public sector, myself in the public and the private sector, of encountering the problems you get when trying to make big spending and big investment decisions, and the problems in sorting out projects and programs that have gone wrong. I spent quite a chunk of my life helping people with things that weren't going according to plan. And so we wanted to share that. And so it was a hope, really, founded on experience and an expectation of what we knew could be done.
Joseph, I'm fascinated by this work you're doing on biodiversity. How do you apply what I would consider to be the science of business analysis, the science of the 5-case model? How can you apply something that is as concrete as that to something that is as broad as biodiversity? Does it really read across? How can you do that?
That's a good way of thinking about it, actually, Richard, a very good way. I think it's sort of analogous to the problems that we encounter in medicine. In the field of medicine, there are people who specialize in ear, nose and throat, upper respiratory issues. There are people who specialize in facial reconstruction and oral MAC surgeons. There are people who specialize in dentistry and who's all kinds of minute subdivisions of the medical profession. And yet, when people become injured in some serious way, actually they need a number of those professions to work together. Or when they get a disease, they need a number of them to work together. And at the same time, the person themselves and their needs have to be taken into account, and the position they are in with their family and all kinds of background considerations. So it's quite a complex position. And there's a lot of bringing the sciences together along with the art form of how you do that in a proportionate way and take into account all the non-science things to do with the person's position, their life, their job, their work, their family, the demands that are made on them, and so on, in trying to get a holistic view of how to help that person. And I think it's very, very similar. We have very many scientific elements to bring to the position, but also we recognize that there are many real world elements out there which we can understand and discuss, but we have to bring in stakeholders, we have to bring in users, we have to bring in people who are involved in the concrete reality in order to blend the science with that information and that knowledge and actually apply it. And actually, it's doing that is the wonder of the 5-case model. It enables us to identify long-run aims, if you like. People's idea of the long run can vary, of course, from next year to 30 years. It depends. It depends on your time horizon and all the rest of it. But you can bring those things together with shorter term things of how do we get there and the different things you have to do to get there. And this can vary from the very, very simple things to the very large and complex. And the beauty of the 5-case model is it's a model that allows you to assemble those different things and to do it in proportion to the problem and the reality that you face. So you can do it in a simple, basic way for simple, small problems, less complex problems, but you can actually unite a lot of things together and deal with very complex, multi-layered problems as well. So it's a rather wonderful model from that point of view.
Joseph, that's fascinating. In my experience of project management, too many people jump to a conclusion too early. So they work out or think they've worked out what's the right solution. Now, within the better business case within the 5 case model, there's something called the options framework. Aren't the options usually obvious? How important is the options framework to actually getting a realistic and an appropriate solution?
That's such a good question. And the answer, the short answer is, it is absolutely vital. It is the key to getting everything right. The design, it is the way in which all these different factors that I was just talking about are brought together. And it's something that people usually skip, as you've pointed out. Back in 2012, the former chair of BP, Lord Brown of Madingley, was a senior non-executive director in the Cabinet Office. And I think he was the most senior non-executive director in all of government. And the then Prime Minister and Chancellor, Cameron and Osborne, asked him to write a report on how to improve public sector's performance in its major programs and projects. And he worked away on this based on his own experience. He didn't come and chat to Joe and I, although one of his assistants did towards the end of what he was doing. And he wrote a report. And a version of that report is still available, actually, on the Cabinet Office website. And in it, he recommended well over 30 actions that the government could take. And what was interesting was that well over 30 of them, although not quite all, were to do things which the guidance that Joe and I were putting out already said we should be doing, and quite clearly we're not doing well enough or all of the time. Some of them were to also desist from this, we know what's needed, let's just get stuck in and do it. We know what we want, we can just go and buy it, which 99 times in 100 turns out to be wrong. The Japanese idea of 2/3 planning, 1/3 implementation, and you get much better quality in a much shorter time with much lower failure rate actually applies usually. That you really need to stand there, stop short, and consult and think and plan thoroughly. When I say plan, the plans have to be flexible as well and take into account risk, not pie in the sky plans that are not realistic. And actually, the options framework filter does that, because for years the Green Book was associated with cost-benefit analysis and at times cost-effectiveness analysis. And they're too marvellous, very sensible ideas. You weigh up what you hope to get out of doing something over what it's going to cost you to do it, including the effect it will have on you if you do it, and the effect on you if you don't do it. Gains versus losses. It's a rational framework, if you like. Very, very good. The thing is, though, if you only present it with options that are a bit silly, then you get the least silly result at the end, but it's still fundamentally silly. And so what the options framework filter does is it allows you to break down the problem into a series of logical components. We call it disaggregation. It breaks it down and allows you to consider each of them along with key stakeholders and experts in the field and the people who are involved in actually trying to do it. And it gives you a logical structure and a way of going through that, and a process which enables you to capture all that knowledge, often with imprecise data where you just know ballpark ideas, indicative data, and also people's experience and knowledge and what they will and won't accept. You have to understand the frameworks that you've got to work within, the constraints we call them. You work within the law, you work within the framework of what people consider to be decent and honest and right and so on, and the things you depend upon that are beyond your control. If you're buying a train, you've got to have tracks to put it on. And if the project can't decide on the tracks, that's a matter for some other place, probably a program. So if you're building the Elizabeth line, then you're part of a program to create the entire new railway line, and perhaps a project within that would be the one to design and procure the kind of trains you want. But you'd have to know all about what the program required from you. And the 5 case model provides for that, and it enables that information to be fed down into the options framework filter. So in fact, it joins things together, and it brings together, if you like, the knowledge of the stakeholders, of the users, of everybody, the experts, and so on, along with the people who are trying to do it, the experts in delivery, the experts in finance, in strategy, in analysis, and so on, in a way. And when it breaks the problem down into these stages that it does, it uses a thing we call critical success factors. And these things actually represent the 5 dimensions of the 5 case model. And at each level of disaggregation, we look at those 5 things. The kind of things that we look at when we're disaggregating are, what is the coverage of this particular proposal? We have to put a limit around it, its scope. Many people plunge into programs and projects just assuming they know what the scope is. And then partway through, they find that half of the program thought it was one thing and half thought it was another. And that leads to disaster. So you have to put a boundary around it. It could be geographical, it could be demographic, it could be a combination of a number of factors to limit the scope. You don't get scope creep then. When you've done that, you have to say, well, we're going to look at this in terms of service, because nobody buys infrastructure for the sake of own it. It's not a matter of conspicuous consumption. We own a bigger bridge than you do. You want a bridge to go somewhere. You're delivering a transportation service across a space with a bridge, or through a mountain with a tunnel or a tube or whatever it is. And you want to convey something. So it's the transportation service that's important. And you say, well, what is the transportation service we're trying to deliver, if that's what the proposal is about? And then you find out the best technical means of providing that. Is it a bridge or a tunnel or a longer road or what? Then you have to think about, well, what's the best technical means of delivering that service? How should it be done? And then who can provide it? And then when can it be provided? Is it a phased implementation? Do we learn as we go? Is it a big bang? And then what are the funding implications? How could it be paid for? What might it cost? And you have to consider each of those against the 5 dimensions through these critical success factors, and also ask, is this liable to meet our SMART objectives that we set ourselves, the things we want to achieve? And they're SMART because we can measure them, at least verify them. If we get them, it'll be clear that they are there and that we haven't failed. So you squeeze out the opportunity for making assumptions that you didn't know you'd made, what I call implicit assumptions, by skipping over them when you just jump to a complete solution. And of course, when you do that, when you jump to a complete solution without thinking it through, and then you go to implement it, you suddenly find all sorts of snags and problems materialize, and suddenly your whole plan is thrown out, and you might wish you'd gone about it in a different way, which had you planned, you would have done. So it's absolutely vital. It is the vital first stage of designing, of appraisal, of analysis, for creating a viable program or project. And what it does, if you employ it correctly, is produce a good short list of options, which you can then use for your cost-benefit analysis or your cost-effectiveness analysis, whichever's appropriate. And then you're not going to get the silly option out, because everything you've put into it is sensible. You've sense-checked it before with the experts, with the stakeholders, with the people who are working on it, so you know it's liable to be viable.
Joseph, that's a fascinating summary, but listening to you, I detect a slight hint that this is what people should do, but not everybody does. So in your experience, do you find people are willing to put in that time and effort, and in particular that thinking at the outset, or is it a challenge to get them to do that?
In the early days, it was a huge challenge getting anyone to do it. When I say the early days, we're talking right back 2007, 2008, before we brought in the Better Business Cases program. And in fact, the Welsh NHS and Welsh Government very kindly and bravely said they would trial the methodology in a strict version of its implementation to see what would happen. And the results of that trial, for all the people who participated in it, were a complete shock, because it not only produced much better business cases, which were delivering better value at lower cost and in shorter time, and avoiding lots of problems and delays which were taking people by surprise before, but it also turned out to be much quicker and cheaper to produce if you actually followed the method, because you actually didn't run into all these hidden snags. And they saved 30 to 40% in the cost of producing the proposal, and produced much better proposals in the end. When that became known, then it became much easier to get people on board. And the result is that the methodology is far better rooted now within large parts of the Welsh Government, because people's experience has led them to see how valuable it is. And over time, since we launched the Better Business Cases program back at the end of 2012, I think it was 2013, we have seen it become easier and easier to get people. I'm not saying it's easy or that everyone does it now, but far more people do it, they're far more ready to do it, and they're following what is best practice. Now, of course, since 2018, the Green Book says it's an absolute mandated necessity that you should use this method, and in 2020, that was reinforced. The Chief Secretary to the Treasury was a man who later became the Chancellor, and who is now the Prime Minister, and he ordered a thorough review of the Green Book and the business case methodology, both in theory and in practice. In 2020, the Treasury assembled a team of people to do that review, and they went and talked to everybody, every critic of the Green Book, every critic of the methodology, all the academics and people who supported it, and all the users who'd used it, to find out what was going on. And they found tremendous enthusiasm from amongst people who'd used it and understood it. They found where it was going wrong is where people were either not using it or had mistaken how to use it, because they'd not really read the guidance properly or gone on training. And actually training turned out to be the key. They'd not gone on the training. So they weren't properly using this options framework filter, and they weren't developing the 5 dimensions of the case together, which is what they should have been doing. They were doing it, or trying to do it, separately, and then scratching their heads and saying, "Oh, what do we do with these 5 things? They don't match." Well, of course they won't match, because they've not been developed holistically through the options framework filter and through the process of the business case development process. So in fact, 2020 absolutely reinforced that, and the Green Book revision in 2020 strengthened everything that was said in 2018 and put in more helpful guidance to people. And since then, we've produced a lot more helpful numbers that people can use off the shelf when they're doing their subsequent valuations and things like that. And that work continues across the public service. There are people now reviewing all the old guidance that was ever written to bring it into alignment with the new 2020 Green Book. But it's a massive task, huge task, and it's a huge task to bring about the change in culture that we need in the public sector to all use the Green Book and the Better Business Cases methodology properly and proportionately all of the time, because people are not used to that. Many of them are very distant from the Treasury, in arm's length bodies, or in things like local health boards, for example, and they've not been trained, and they just look at the guidance and think, oh, it's more bureaucracy. They don't understand. But once they've been trained, they can see immediately, oh, it's very helpful. We can use this. We don't have to think about how to think. We can just get along with thinking about the problems that we have to solve and use this as a method to help us. And then they're on board. So it's people who are trained who become the real evangelists, if you like, for it.
Joseph, it's fascinating, really, because all the updates and all the revisions you remain very, very true to the core. Other best practice tends to plug other things into it and wants to expand away from its core domain and encroach into other areas. But, you refrain from putting in explicit links to things like, say, benefits management or facilitation. They're mentioned, but they're mentioned in passing, and you're not being prescriptive about what people should use. Is that accidental, or was that a positive decision, or is that driven by sort of government policy?
Well, it's an actual deliberate decision of Joe Flanagan and I, which has been supported by our bosses and by then brought into by ministers, if you like, successively over the years. And the reason for it is this, that, you can't rule the world. The world's a great big thing. And it's always changing and always evolving, and people are finding new ways to do things, or sometimes just reselling and resurrecting old ones and giving them new names. That goes on a lot. And we really just want to make sure that people understand the essential things that you should be doing, what they're about and how to go about them. And because the Green Book makes provision for doing these things at the right place and how they should be done and what should come out of them, it's pretty relaxed about how people, what latest trendy label they put on a thing. So whether they're using older guidance like managing successful programs or Prince 2, or they're using new agile guidance when they're producing systems, or even people who are coming along now and saying to me, do you know, Joseph, you should be using agile management techniques. And I quiz them about those techniques, and it turns out what they're talking about is a system whereby you run a proposal knowing that your knowledge isn't fully complete with a pilot scheme, and you see how it goes, and then you adapt from what you learn, and then you try another pilot scheme. Well, actually, our guidance says you can do things like that already. So if you've got something a bit more detailed that fleshes out how you run pilots and all the rest of it, good luck to you. Do it. I don't mind whether you call it agile or not. But Bent Flyberg or Fluvier, I can never pronounce Bent's name because I'm not Danish, and it's a bit of a trial for English people. But the man who has made so much contribution through promoting the intelligent use of optimism bias is also saying to people that we should break big problems down into smaller units. And that's exactly what our methodology facilitates. And he talks about the cost-benefit fallacy in one of his recent papers. Very interesting paper. What he's talking about there, though, is the way people make the wrong assumptions about cost-benefit analysis and use it wrongly, which is what they were doing before we brought in the proper use of the business case methodology. What our options framework filter and all the other things we have do is actually squeeze out and bear down on those problems. They give people a way of dealing with these things so that you can then sensibly employ cost-benefit analysis and you don't run into these problems. So we break things down into their component parts. That's why we say most projects should really be part of a bigger program. And in the public sector, we've got very long-run goals. For example, the country is committed legally now through various governments to a net zero carbon emissions policy by 2050. Now, clearly, we're not going to get there by crossing our fingers and hoping for it. And there are two routes. One is big programs and projects that have specific things in mind to do with perhaps electricity generation or conversion of private use of various forms of energy from one thing to another, and through everyday decisions. And both of those things, both of those ways of approaching the problem are dealt with by the business case methodology, and you can have multiple programs organized into strategic portfolios that perhaps will deliver over a 30-year period or a 25-year period going towards 2050. And those programs might deal with different aspects of getting down to net zero. And within the programs, there'll be the actual projects that deliver the tangible outputs, if you like, the systems, the infrastructure, the people, the education, and so on that bring it about. So it's a very amenable, deliberately adaptable, high-level set of guidance that can help us with all these things, whatever new labels or whatever really new innovations we have for the units that we use within them.
Joseph, that's interesting. You mentioned this concept of optimism bias, which I would imagine is a very human thing. And with the recent innovations I've been reading about on artificial intelligence, like ChatGPT, do you think AI could write a good business case? Or is it something that is essentially human?
It is absolutely essentially human, because it's not about writing, it's about exploring, analysing, making choices and developing. And it's human politics, not political politics, the sort of politics you would get in any rugby club or football club or tennis club or anything at all. It is what people need and want and believe and how they work. And it's bringing everything together, the science and the realities of the world that we're in at any particular moment, using the techniques that we have, such as the options framework filter, writing it once you've made the decisions, and if you can capture the reasons why each decision was made, is relatively easy. And actually, things like computerized systems could potentially help in capturing the decisions that are made, perhaps in workshop situations, whereby, the typing up of a conclusion, when we're looking at a particular thing that we've broken down, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats, because that's standard SWOT analysis procedure, and we employ that using our critical success factors and the other things that we have. Writing that up, it could take some of the chore out of that, clearly, or perhaps it will improve dictation. Some of the, for ages we've had software where people can dictate to computers and they attempt to type it up. But as everyone who's tried to use this stuff knows, you have to train them to understand your voice, and even then you have to go through and do laborious editing of what the thing thinks you said. So that's got a long way to go. So they can use it as aids, but they can't actually take over the decision-making process, the thinking process, because it's multidimensional and it involves all kinds of valuation. We take into account things which cannot be quantified, but which are important to people. And the way we do that is to look at options that don't cater for those factors, but that if they were introduced would cost a little more or a lot more. And we work out what their extra cost would be and what the consequences are, and then say to the decision maker, well, look, you said this was a very important thing. Here are a number of options for you. And if you include this very important thing, it does this to the cost. And if you don't, it doesn't. So is that a price you think it's worth paying? And that's helping the decision maker to get their head around the problem. And if you do that, if you give them several different ways of catering for this thing with different cost levels, well, they can make a decision between the one they think is the most acceptable and the one that perhaps the public would, if you like, approve of, if they're an official or if they're a minister. And that can be very valuable. It might be very valuable to understand the value of a landscape to people. But you really can't put a number on the value of a landscape. That's just too tricky. And if you tried, you'd probably come up with a number, but people would argue about it so much they wouldn't believe it. So at the end of the day, you have to use techniques like this. And we allow for that. So you can't use AI for that. It's much more human. And it's about thinking, not writing, and about listening to people and consulting people and understanding. That's not to say that you always do what everybody wants. You can't do that. It's about actually trying to take into account the different factors in a proportionate and intelligent way that produces a balanced result.
Joseph, thank you very much. Before we finish, I've got one final question for you. I'd like to put you on the spot. Can you think of a business case or workshop you were involved in where going into it, the sponsor had a very clear view on what the outcome should be, but following the workshop, it was a totally different concept that was taken forward.
There are quite a few things like that. Just calling one to mind for the moment above the others is somewhat difficult because I'm not in that thinking space. But I most certainly have seen people change the direction they thought something was going to go in as a result of the workshop, because they've started with preconceived ideas. I've also seen instances where people didn't do the workshops and they pressed on with a preconceived idea, and reality forced them to rethink. And we see these in our major programs all the time, where they're rethought, reconsidered and cut back, and the costs have perhaps gone through the roof. It's certainly happened with the high-speed train going north, which is now no longer a Y-shaped line, but a single branch going north, and isn't going to where it was originally said. It's going less far, and so on. That's not to say that in future other lines may not be built, may not be high speed and all the rest of it, and that there won't be very nice trains. I'm sure they will. But the point is, the original concept has been rethought because reality has forced that on people, whereas the early stage thinking that we now recommend they should have gone through and did not would have enabled them to see it from the beginning. That's partly the room we have for very long run, medium term and short term things, I think. There are lots of things which in the very long run might be desirable and will get done, but which perhaps in the medium run only partially get done, and they get done through a series of short term things that have to be delivered, which adding up make up the medium term thing that you want to deliver. So it took quite a while to build the Elizabeth line than we thought, simply because there were things and complications that occurred in its building that perhaps weren't apparent when we started to build it. Anyone who's tried to renovate an old house knows this, that you come across hidden snags. And what our process does, by bringing in experience from the past as well as experts and stakeholders, is you try to bring out as many of those potential snags as you can early on in order to have a strategy for avoiding them or dealing with them so they don't become a problem.
Joseph, as always, it's fascinating talking to you. We could go on for a lot longer, I'm sure, but many thanks for your time, and no doubt we'll speak again. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. We're always keen to hear your feedback and suggestions for future episodes. You can find all the information in the show notes below. Please visit apmg-international.com to find out more about our accredited training and the certifications that support them that are related to the topics discussed in this series. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I look forward to you joining future episodes while we continue our exploration into best practice and the benefits it brings to global business. Thank you.